The opinions and views expressed in the following presentation do not necessarily reflect those of GameCon Radio or its affiliates.
Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We rock your world. Okay. Welcome to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio on GameConRadio.com. We're rocking your world tonight. Our guest is waiting on the side, retired Captain David G. Brown, and he's written a book, The Last Log of Titanic, and we're going to be talking about that and all the myths concerning Titanic. But first, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank everybody in the chat room and anybody, all the people that use the players. And we will have people from all over the world listening tomorrow to the recording of this show. And all our shows are always recorded, and I put it on a podcast so people can hear it, who are in other time zones. I know that, like we have Spooky UK comes in, and we have Ghost, and we have a lot of people from England and all over the world. And thank you so much for being up at 3 a.m. in the morning to listen to us live. But I do record the show just in case you want to get a night's sleep on a Tuesday night. I want to thank everybody for being there. I hope everybody's Easter was lovely. Last week was the Passion Week, and it culminates in Easter. And Easter Sunday, usually by then, everybody is just drained. I hope everybody's Easter was wonderful. Our Jewish friends are still celebrating Passover. God bless you. I hope that your Passover is wonderful and reflective, and your family and you are close. Our prayers go out to everybody who's struggling with Mother Nature. She's been crazy. We had pansies blooming in January here in New Jersey, and then February was warm. March was brutal. It actually hit 80 degrees, and now we're back to the wind is blowing so hard you can't stand outside. And it's cool, and it's dropping down to the 30s again at night. So this is prime time for everybody to get sick. But I hope everybody is safe. And remember Salvation Army, the Red Cross. These are great charities to help people who are really in dire straits from all the tornadoes and storms and flooding that we've been hit. And they help all over the world. And also don't forget animal rescue groups that are trying to save animals. With people losing their homes, a lot of animals are displaced. Older animals, they can't take them to the new apartment. They're not allowed to have animals, so they're dumping these older animals. And they've done nothing wrong except that their families couldn't keep them anymore. So please, a bag of food, some clean blankets cut up. If you can maybe donate a few items to your local shelters, I would be over the moon, and God would shine on you for that. So please remember, there's a lot of people that are struggling right now. Crazy but news. I'm going to keep it short, but I think the craziest poor thing that happened is in Canterbury, Australia. Some poor pilot took off to fly his plane, and a snake popped out of his dashboard. and he had to call the tower and say, I gotta land, I gotta land. And he landed with the snake coming in and out, dropping in and out from this dashboard. And at one point, it actually slithered across his leg to try to get to the cargo part of the plane, trying to get away. They think that the plane maybe had been chasing a mouse or something and got into the plane. And of course, they got the snake. It was a non-venomous snake, and they turned it loose. But the pilot was a little bit shook up by that. And, you know, I can't say I wouldn't be shook up by that either. Another crazy but news: man shoots himself in the heart with nails and survives. You gotta give it to Camden, New Jersey. Camden, New Jersey is the weirdest place in New Jersey. Trust me. A self-employed builder in New Jersey hoped to be out of the hospital this weekend. He shot himself in the heart with a nail gun. And he said it poked him in the chest and hit him, and he needed to be resuscitated. He went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance, but they managed to get him to the University Hospital, and they actually saved him. So, you know, what are you going to do? You got to be careful with those power tools, guys. You know, we're not all Tim Allen, you know. And a lady, a town in Wyoming, Beaufort, Wyoming, was auctioned off for $900,000, and it has a population of one person. Don't ask me why they had to auction it off. There's only one person living there. But an unidentified Vietnamese man placed the winning bid. So now Beaufort, Wyoming is owned by a Vietnamese man, and who says the American dream is out of reach. Even foreigners own America. So that's our crazy but news. This week is a rough week. I know the TV is just flooded with Titanic stuff, and unless you're under a rock someplace, 100 years ago, April 15th, Titanic sank on her maiden voyage. And as the people in Belfast said, she was fine when she left there, so it wasn't their fault that she sank. But that caused me to start looking around and trying to figure out what exactly did happen to it. And we all hear all these stories about all the romance and the Gilded Age. Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age, where there was so much in excess and all of that. It kind of obscures the real story. I mean, yeah, there was death with this, but why? Why did it happen? And so I started looking around and for an expert, and I went to the Titanic Society, and they, the International Titanic Society, and they directed me to Captain David G. Brown. And he is a expert on this and has written a book about Titanic called The Last Log of Titanic. And I want to welcome him onto the show now. Welcome, David, to my lair. David? Did I lose him? Okay. Well, David has written a couple of books about Titanic. Let me give you his credentials. Okay. We're calling David back. He's on a cell phone, so we lost him for a minute.
Hello.
Hello, David. Are you back?
I don't know what happened.
I don't either, but welcome to my lair.
I think that we sank.
Yeah, we sank.
Electronically, at least.
For God's sake. Like Ballard said, she sank. That's what happened to her. How did you get involved with writing a book about Titanic?
Actually, I've written two, but the way I got started was when I saw the movie, the way they show the ship turning left and just grazing the right side of the bow, the starboard side of the bow, is not just not likely. It's a physical impossibility. And so I got started there. That I realized that most people, when they envision the accident, are driving a car. And in a car, you can turn right and you can bump, say, like a telephone pole with your. You can turn left and bump like a telephone pole with your right fender, and pull away from the telephone pole and not damage the right side of your car by turning left. In a boat, if you did that, it steers from the back end, and it does just the opposite. The back end would swing out, and you would wind up causing more damage all along the right side of your car if it were a boat. And so I realized that the way the accident was depicted just doesn't happen in real life with boats and ships that are steered with rudders. And so from there, I started developing Last Log of the Titanic based on the testimony of what did happen from the officers. Now comes a decade later after that book, and I've followed on with Titanic Myths and Titanic Truths, and that's my newest book, in which I take to task a lot of the myths that people have built up over the years, some of which are in my first book because I didn't realize they were myths at the time. And so that's basically where it developed. My experience handling ships and boats basically told me that the accident didn't happen the way they say in the movies, or even the way Walter Lord in his classic A Night to Remember describes it. It just doesn't fit the way ships run, the way they operate in any way. So that's how I got started. From there, I got into, what did happen on the bridge? And then that developed into, now what happened? Why did the ship sink? And I know that sounds silly because everybody knows it filled with water. Well, yes, but why did a ship that had the damage the Titanic actually experienced sink? And one of the things I discovered, we can get into all this in detail as the night goes on, but is that the damage as described by the crew is not the damage that is described in the official reports and in the myths. And when I started examining the actual evidence, I found that the crew was right. Titanic did not receive the damage that should have sunk it. It should have been savable, certainly at least until morning when the Carpathia arrived. So that's one of my latest and frankly most disturbing things. When I say disturbing, it bothered me. I mean, I was worried by that too.
Yeah. Let me ask you something. You've been researching this for over 14 years now, right?
Well, basically, yeah. Most of it, and in a way, almost all my life, because I got A Night to Remember, Walter Lord's book, when it first came out, and I've had that book. That's the first book in my personal library. I'll never probably get rid of it. It's still got my 8th grade homeroom in it, Mm-hmm. So I've been reading and learning about the Titanic all my life, but it's only been since the movie came out that I've actually really started researching it as a project.
Mm-hmm. You didn't see the movie The Night to Remember. You're talking about you started with the book first, right?
The movie I'm talking about is Jim Cameron's movie Titanic.
Okay.
The movie A Night to Remember back in the 50s, the black and white British movie, is a delight, and it's very close to reality with some things that were not knowable at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Would be changed. But they did a much better job in terms of history than Cameron did.
Yeah, but in his defense, when he pitched this whole thing, he said the way he pitched it to investors was Romeo and Juliet meet the sinking ship disaster, and that's how he got the funding. So A Night to Remember, there were still survivors, that were alive when that was made. So I think that they were maybe obligated a little more to adhere more to the truth and not the romance and the on ship thing and all that. We have a question because there's a chat, and I'm going to ask questions as they hit because I won't be able to do it later. Okay.
Not a problem.
Okay. Spooky UK. He's in England. He's asking, a factor in the breakup of the ship appears to be micro cracks around the rivet hole. They were caused by cold punched through the steel plates prior to riveting and the plates to the framing. Is there anything the builders could have done to make the steel more resistant to cracking back then?
Well, the answer is yes, and that's why our steel is better today. But actually, that begs the that's an anachronism. It's a tempocentric error to think that because we know how to do it, they should have. They were doing the best that the technology of the time allowed. Today we would punch the holes and then ream them out or drill them out to take away the micro cracking. However, I think that sometimes people stretch to find a new reason that Titanic sank, looking for headlines or a new reason for a documentary. I won't say that I've been totally above that in my life, so let me say I'm part of that. But the fact is that when we look at all of the engineering studies done today with computerized studies of the ship, it did not break until it exceeded the strain on the hull exceeded the design of the hull girder. In other words, the actual ship as built was stronger than what Harland and Wolff designed. So I don't think that getting into micro cracks and all of that, whether the rivets were all perfect or not, the fact is Titanic's hull had reached the breaking point. I mean, everything has a point at which it yields, and that's where Titanic broke. And the angle, the latest study says 15, 16 degrees. The one I was associated with, we found out 11 to 13. I don't find those two to be at all different, but definitely the breakup started at a fairly shallow angle and not a steep angle. And I think the breakup had nothing to do with the steel or anything like that. It's just that you put too much strain on anything, it will break.
Yeah, they said, and no matter who you read that has investigated this, they use the best steel, the best method for the day. And really, how many ships were built that same way and nothing happened? They didn't sink. You know what I mean? So.
Well, yes.
Okay.
No,
yeah. Can you hear me?
That's it. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The fact is there were thousands of ships. It wasn't a weak ship. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
And people are looking for reasons. It makes good headlines to say, oh, it had weak rivets, or oh, it had micro cracks, or all this. But those are all things that we already knew about the era. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the cause of the sink. Did it contribute? Maybe yes. Mm-hmm. But by the time the ship broke apart, Titanic was, the fat lady had gone home. There was no singing to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's also saying, why did they not weld instead of riveting most of the areas of the ship likely to endure these stresses? I don't know about metallurgy and all, but it seems to be that those plates had to move to some degree, didn't they? Okay,
first of all, they didn't weld, and there's a good reason. They didn't have welding equipment. Okay. The technology didn't exist. There were two welds in Titanic, and they were thermite welds, which is it's a very kind of like slow motion dynamite is the best way to explain it. and it doesn't blow things apart. It just gets them hot enough they weld together.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't weld it. Old-time sailors prefer riveted ships because the rivets and the plates can move a little bit. The ships don't break as easy, frankly. And now I think that in today's world that may be old wives' tale, but I know back there are a lot of ships on the Great Lakes, and I've talked to a lot of sailors going back into at least in the 40s, and the ships that go back to the time of Titanic. And most of the people from the old school like to be on riveted ships rather than welded ones. There are some definite advantages to rivets. I'm not sure that welding would have saved it.
Okay, thank you. The books are Titanic's Myths, Titanic's Truths, How a Series of Errors Caused History's Most Famous Maritime Disaster. And then the other one is The Last Log of Titanic. And we're going to try to go down and keep this a little bit in order. But let's see, your book in Titanic's Myths, Truths, and how much do we know of the story that is actually myth? It's not based on anything, it's just making up.
I suspect there are a few things that are totally myth, but basically the myths are based on fact. They're not totally just random, fairy tales. Mm-hmm. What happened is that the stories were told in a way that presented a picture that the people who might have been hurt by the sinking could explain away any blame or that kind of thing. I don't think it was a cover up in the backroom cigar smoking type thing. I think it was, quite frankly, just everybody trying to present a picture that didn't do them any harm. And of course, it's like on your income tax. You can, as long as you declare your income, you can make any sort of claims about deductions, and it's legal. And they were doing the same thing. They were just trying to make sure that their form looked good. There are a lot of myths that some are worse than others. I think one of the ones that bothers me the most is I know that Captain Smith was not asleep, but yet you'll read in book after book after book that he was in his cabin snoozing. Not true. You will read that they were speeding through the ice field. And typically they say, it was the greedy company that wanted to go speeding through the ice field. Well, not true. It's just when you get to the nubbin of the thing, they were going fast near ice, but they weren't going deliberately fast to speed into the ice. That was. It's easy to say one thing and actually I'm trying to do this politely, but I think a lot of people would rather have a good politically correct story for their point of view than the history. Mm-hmm. So the reason Titanic was near the ice is because they wanted to make a fast passage, but they wanted to make a fast passage because the passengers demanded it. Not because the company did. It would have been more profitable for Titanic to go slower because it's been cheaper to feed them for another day or two than to pay for all the coal that it cost to run the ship as it was steaming. Coal is expensive, and speed, your burning of coal goes up by the cube as the speed increases. So, going at 16 knots would have been a lot more profitable for White Star than 22.
And we have to remember something. There was a coal strike going on, and Titanic normally should have taken off with something like 800 tons of coal, and it only came away 800,000 tons of coal, but it only ended up with 550,000 tons of coal.
Because
of the strike.
It had 6,000 and something ton capacity. There was 5,000 and something. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, and I'm frankly I'm in my car driving, so I'm not going to.
No, and I want you to be safe.
But the fact is that she had a safe amount of coal, but she did not have extra coal for any, and it wasn't possible to do a speed run anyway, like people think. The Titanic was obviously, they hoped to be able to crank 24 knots out of the design. That's pretty obvious. It turned out to be about a 22 to 23 knot design. And I think that may be more because of propeller technology than anything else. But the thing made it. That night, Boxhall said it was going 22 knots. When I reconstruct the Dead Reckoning, that's the navigation. 22 knots works with the numbers that he gave the court. So that doesn't prove they were going 22. It only proves that Boxhall gave the court 22 knots, and he also used it in his navigation. But the speed, it's a red herring. What Titanic was doing, Captain Smith was going to what we call coast around the ice. That is, not go run downhill like a roller coaster, but he was going to go around the ice with the idea of staying a certain distance away from the southern tip of the ice field. And that's, I've got proof, and again, this is one thing, it won't translate to radio. I can draw it out on a chart. I can show you that they turned left about one compass point the time is a problem here, and that's another thing that doesn't translate to radio. But about somewhere around a half hour before the accident, and then about the time of the accident, I propose that they've made another left turn at 2 points. But the first turn is dead nuts for certain, because it works out with the geographic coordinates they sent out in what are called CQD messages, or the distress. They did use SOS, but in those days CQD was the message for distress. And so you can see that they actually were dodging the ice that night, which proves, by the way, that Captain Smith is awake, as Fourth Officer Boxhall said, and he was in his navigation room plowing the ice and planning a strategy to get around it. So the myth that Captain Smith was asleep on his couch is totally debunked.
Okay, we're going to go to break on that break, and we're going to play 2 songs. I picked music tonight for tonight's show, nothing from the movie, Cameron's movie, so nobody expect to hear My Heart Will Go On, because you're not going to. What I decided to do was to play music that I knew that the band on Titanic would be playing for the people during the whole 5-day, 7-day cruise. And so I started looking up, and I've got the White Star March and Oh You Beautiful Doll, and they're the first 2 pieces we're going to play after the commercial. And we'll be right back with Captain Brown, and we're going to talk more about Titanic, what happened, and who was right, who was wrong, and what was totally made up. We'll be right back.
Just a reminder, guys, all our talk show hosts here at GameCon Radio volunteer their time, but you can always show your appreciation. Click on the tip jar and give them a little love. I'm sure maybe your predictions will come out a little bit better. And that's how we roll here at GameCon Radio. We rock your game and your paranormal.
This is Michelle Tomlinson, the Scream Queen, and I listen to GameCon Radio. Why? Because it rocks.
Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio. Our guest, Captain David G. Brown, is driving home and doing our interview. He was in Ohio doing a lecture on Titanic today, and the way the show fell, unfortunately, he's on a head jack talking to us as he's driving, and so he is hands-free, so I hope that God keeps him safe. That's all I'm worried about. And Matt said don't hit any ice flows or anything. So our guest tonight has written a minute-by-minute account of the iceberg accident and the sinking of the Titanic from his perspective and expertise as a mariner. Usually books are history or romanticized, or they're strictly historians trying to do the history bit and give you an entire rundown of what happened. These books are an incredible opportunity to get someone who actually knows what they're talking about. When Captain Smith was faced with making decisions, David Brown knows exactly what he was thinking and why he made the decisions he made. And so some of them worked, some of them didn't, and that's what we're here to talk about tonight. There were a lot of people one of our member people of the chat were asking, they said that they had heard a lot of the people had been taken from other ships and put on Titanic because of the coal shortage. So a lot of the smaller ships were canceled out. Their coal was moved to Titanic, and their passengers were switched over to Titanic. But so was a lot of the crew, too, to make up for the need for crew for such a large complement of passengers. So a lot of these passengers were not well versed with the Titanic. They had maybe a crash course of a few hours saying, okay, this is where this is where this was, right, Dave?
Well, okay, there are a couple of questions. There's a lot of questions there. Yes, there were people transferred because of the coal strike and ships being laid up. That is not my area of expertise.
Right.
Now, the crew, you had sign-on days and people would come down and it was kind of a hiring hall thing. There were a lot of people who were always hired. I mean, the company had some flexibility in that. And the crew that most people think of that would stay with the ship would be the stewards and stewardesses. Actually, with tips and everything, the head steward or head stewardess in first class could very well make a living better than the captain on some of those transatlantic liners. They were the kind of people that could remember how you liked your tea, and then 3 years later you would be on the ship and they would deliver it to you and they'd know exactly what you wanted. Mm-hmm. That was a profession that kind of has died out. But the crew that is the real crew of Titanic, believe it or not, were the 6 officers and the 48 seamen. And when you look at that, that's a fairly small number of people for such a large ship. But they were actually the trained crew. The 48 men, by the way, is what determined the number of lifeboats, because you have 16 lifeboats, and each lifeboat takes 2 men. You've got to have a trained seaman bow and stern just to release the falls. They're like a block and tackle and lower the boat down. And while in Titanic's case it was very calm, and that wasn't the problem, if it had been at all rough, if the falls aren't released properly, the boat will tip over and everybody will thrown into the sea. So that was important to have those 2 seamen. So basically you have eliminated, as you launch your boats, 32 of the 48 men. That leaves, a very small number left, 16. It takes 2 men on the forward falls and 2 men on the after falls, so 4 men to lower the boat from the deck while it's going down. So basically, what you've got is with those 16 men, if you need 4, so 4 goes into 16 4 times. You can see you could launch one of the port boats forward and one aft, one forward and one aft on the starboard side, and you've accounted for all of your trained crew.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think necessarily that because that's a big thing that everybody brings up, is that maybe the crew just wasn't up to the challenge and didn't have enough time to become familiar with the ship. You don't think that's true?
Well, not in historical context, no.
Okay.
In truth, yes. Now, what do I mean? Today, for instance, you have to have trained, they're called lifeboatmen, for every lifeboat. And you have to have certain numbers, and it's determined by the size of the ship and so on and the equipment. But basically, what they've done is now, in Titanic's day, if you were a cook or you were a maid, you really didn't get much training in anything nautical. Well, today they will take these people and they will send them to special school to learn to be certificated lifeboatmen, and that means they know how to operate the lifeboat. This is how you get enough crew in the lifeboats. Mm-hmm. They didn't think that way in 1912. Mm-hmm. So to apply modern thinking back to 1912 is just wrong. But to learn from 1912 and come up with ways that we won't have these problems, that's good, that's learning, and that's what you're supposed to do from disaster. And so don't apply it backwards. It isn't a failing of White Star. It's a failing of our knowledge, our learning curve, if you will.
Right. Okay. They're asking, and I don't know if you would necessarily know, because they're asking, were the people, the crew from England, but the ship was built in Belfast, and I imagine you had a lot of different nationalities, like from Europe, working on that ship, right? Depending on their skills.
I'm sure they did, but predominantly British and British Isles. It was not an era when you had the wide variety of people that we now find commonly aboard cruise liners and things. Different times. Again, that's applying modern thinking to and modern experience to something a long time ago. And 100 years is a long time ago, no matter how you cut it.
It is. And we are trying to go back and understand something using what is acceptable behavior and laws now. And we forget that the reason that we have the laws we do now is because of something that happened in the past, which forced us to have to make these laws. At the time Titanic sailed, she actually had more lifeboats than the law required, right?
Well, that's true. And first of all, I want to say that the term lifeboat is a very misleading term. In 1912, the idea was that the boat was going to take you from the sinking ship to safety. And that's all it was going to do. So it was a water taxi. Mm-hmm. And that was the intent in 1912 of lifeboats. That hasn't changed all that much. I mean, the fact is that the life-saving system of Titanic was dependent to some extent on 3 different things. First of all was the bulkhead system. And the bulkhead system, the idea there was that the ship would stay afloat long enough to get help alongside. Okay, then you have the bulkhead system But past that, you have the lifeboats. The lifeboats, the idea was that they would transfer the passengers to a rescue ship. And of course, that's the third part of the system is radio and the rescue ship. So what we're looking at is an attempt to rescue people by this system, or to save people. And it worked rather well in Titanic if the ship had floated longer. And it's the reason it didn't float that becomes the question we should be asking, because the rest of the life-saving system worked very well. The lifeboats worked perfectly. As terms of saving lives, in terms of getting people off the ship, we find that Carpathia responded rather quickly and got there in a hurry. I mean, that didn't fail. So what went wrong? Titanic didn't stay afloat like its bulkhead system should have kept it afloat, and that should be looked at as a kind of a red herring in the story, because what went wrong?
So what did go wrong?
Well, in my view, and you notice how I'm doing a weasel wording there, but I am saying this is my opinion, because I don't have the ability to see into the past any more than anybody else does.
Right.
But what it looked like to me is that they never properly, as we would say in damage control today, dewatered the ship. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. They worried too much about boiler explosions at first, and which, by the way, is not necessarily a bad deal, because boiler explosions were common on ships with a different style of boilers than Titanic had. So I think they were valid in doing that in the context of 1912. And when they finally started dewatering the ship, it looks to me very much like a mistake in that allowed water into a compartment that shouldn't have been in. And basically a mistake in operating the bilge pumping system is what sank the ship.
Mm-hmm. What happened was they were ordered to stop the ship, right? And then they were told to let pressure off, and that allowed the water to come in because the pressure was released?
Yeah, I got to that's a not far from the truth, but not exact. What I see happened is when the ship, first of all, the ship was not as badly damaged as everyone says. The people on board said that it had one compartment less damage than what everybody thinks, and my research says that the people on board were correct. Now, that means if you go back to the guy who designed it, Wilding, that means Titanic shouldn't have sunk, is what it boils down to, and it did.
Okay.
So we have to ask why. And what I found is that there's evidence of one incident where they allowed water to gravitate, and that is, they went through from one compartment to another through the bilge pump system piping. They allowed it to gravitate into this what's called the fireman's tunnel, and that would happen if you have they have a 10-inch bilge main, and they have various what they call suctions, which are openings where you can suck water out of a compartment. Mm-hmm. And so what I looked at is, all right, if you open the valve on the suction in a dry compartment, and that main is already open to a flooded compartment, water will go from the flooded compartment into the dry compartment. And they seem to have done this accidentally to the fireman's tunnel. Now, the fireman's tunnel incident is no great shakes. It didn't sink the boat, and it really would have been just an incidental part of the story if the ship had not sunk. But later on, almost an hour after the impact, what we see is the water is not yet, there's no water overtopping bulkheads or anything of that sort. And then all of a sudden in boiler room number 5, there's what Barrett, the man who was a rush of water that came into the boiler room, and he escaped. And this looks very like somebody opened one of the sections in boiler room 5, and they opened it on the charged 10-inch bilge deduction main and basically sank the ship that way. And it follows right in a time when the engineer, there had been an injured engineer, and the other 2 senior officers in the compartment went to help him. So basically there was a breakdown in the chain of command in boiler room number 6. Oh, I'm sorry, boiler room number 5. So it's very likely that a zealous crew member, thinking he was doing the right thing, might have actually done in the ship.
Mm-hmm. Let me back up a minute because I do have something I want Matt to play for everybody listening. You and I won't be able to hear it, but they will hear it, the listeners. I actually have a recording of Titanic's whistles when they were brought up from the ocean floor. They were cleaned up, refurbished, and they were played once. And I have the recording of these, the whistles for it. And this is what they were sounding that night once they struck the iceberg and were in trouble. Can you play it twice for them? Okay, those were the whistles, Titanic's actual whistles that you heard. I want to back up a bit because the actual hitting of the iceberg, when I was young and in school, I was always taught that the bigger part of the iceberg is always underneath the water, And so when, you see the movies or you read about it, it says they kind of went to the side of it to try to avoid it. But obviously, there's probably something under there. And I always thought that the bottom of the keel had to come into contact with the bottom of the iceberg. It's probably a pretty good bet that it was like sliding on it, because the bottom, what they saw of the iceberg on top is only, as they call, the tip of the iceberg. The bigger part is underneath. And I figured maybe it took out a chunk of, before they found it and all. I had thought maybe it took out a chunk of the base and they just weren't aware of it because they had the floorboarding and everything under them, so they really didn't know that damage was done. Now, all these years later, they found 2 pieces of the bottom, which is, I guess, the keel or whatever it's called, the bottom of the ship. They found 2 plates. You don't think that happened? Do you think that happened during the breakup, or do you think that happened when they hit the iceberg?
All right, we got a bunch of things to talk about here. First of all, the 2 pieces of double bottom, I'll come back to those. They came out of the ship during the breakup or shortly thereafter and are not part of the iceberg. Okay. Now, my theory, and I think I'm actually, to me it's beyond a theory, is that the ship, first of all, the shape of the iceberg it almost precludes any sort of a side swipe, which is what everybody likes to think. Just that it's a sloping side. It's a pinnacle berg. There's no question about that because of where it is. And it more than likely spreads out rather rapidly underwater because there is more ice underwater than above water. I believe that the ship rolled over I don't know what to call it, a spur of the ice, a shoulder of the ice. envision it as anything you want, but I think the Titanic rolled over it. The lookout said that the starboard side was lifted slightly as they went over the ice. And of course, that would indicate that the ice was underneath the ship lifting up. They weren't hitting it from the side. If they had done a side swipe like the conventional wisdom, the mast would have done a whipping action, but they never felt a whipping action. They felt the side lift. So the actual descriptions by passengers and crew, to me, sound like a grounding and not much else. And so I think it really ran aground. Now, that said, where would the damage be? Very difficult for me to explain. If everybody will look up here at my blackboard, I'll draw it. You know, it's difficult in radio to explain this sort of thing. But when you have a straight sidewall of a ship and a straight flat bottom, the joint where they meet, even though it's radiused into what's called the turn of the bilge, that joint is a problem area. If you try to roll the ship across something, it will tear apart. And in my book, I'd say it would cause damage right where Barrett said it did. He saw the side of the ship open up and water come in, so I believe he did. I think he was wrong where he said he was standing, but I know he saw what he saw. Mm-hmm. And so I believe it's a roll, kind of almost like rolling shear that really created the damage, not a side swipe. That said, it appears the ship did kind of come into hard contact in way of hold number 3, which flooded very, very quickly. Then the ship came out of contact with the ice. There was obviously a very small amount of secondary contact in way of boiler room number 4. Now, this water is totally ignored, and like the Cameron thing, they didn't talk about it. I don't see anybody talking about it. But the ship bumped hard enough when boiler room number 4 was next to it that it knocked down an avalanche of coal in one of the bunkers and trapped Trimmer Cavell, and people up in the smoking room felt it. And so there was that was the second contact of the iceberg and the last. And then the iceberg, because the ship was turning to the right, the iceberg appeared to go away from the starboard side, passed close aboard. I mean, Rowe, the quartermaster on the poop deck, was very, very worried about it. It was that close, but he said the ship was on starboard helm and the stern was swinging away as it went past. So there was no more contact, and that's because Murdoch did a good job of confining damage to the bow. As I said earlier, when you can't avoid something, you take a glancing blow, and that's what he did. Mm-hmm. So basically, yes, I think the ship ran aground via the best way of explaining it. It didn't run into, sideswipe the iceberg. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing about it is that the pattern of damage, as I said, was basically theoretically survivable. The problem, the hidden secret to the sinking of Titanic is the water in boiler room number 4. It was coming in very slowly, but nonetheless rising, and there seems to have been no effort to pump that water out. There was the boiler room number 6. They break the first and took away the ability of the pump the steam. They took away the steam from the pump and took away its ability to pump water out of the boat. Mm-hmm. To pump you switch over to the pump in boiler room number 5. Well, they had, for a combination of reasons, including the blackout in the boiler rooms, they had let the boilers go dry there, and they had a real problem. That could have caused a great explosion, and it didn't. And that was because they sampled that. Well, by that time, now they have no power for the big pump in boiler room number 5. They've got to start figuring a way of getting pumps to work on boiler room 6 that aren't supposed to go there. And so, they were facing a cascade of troubles, and that's always the case in a disaster, especially a shipping disaster. The troubles always cascade. And I think, that's why there could have been a mistake in opening the wrong valve and things go wrong.
Going back to the bottom of the ship, it's a V shape. okay, I'm talking very simplistic because I am not a sailor or a maritime person. I was never in the Navy. So now you got a V shape, and it's sliding on this solid mass of ice, which is really, really hard. And if you think of the pressure of the weight on top of that keel, on that small, that very bottom of that V, all that weight on that ship is coming down. Obviously, there's a good chance that something on the side is going to spring because it's being pushed up and all this weight is still there pressing down on it, you know? So, so we have this buckling of the plates, which happened, and she's floating. Someone in the chat a few minutes ago said Captain Smith had heard there was more ice than usual, but he didn't seem to believe that it was going to be that bad. But there was a ship a couple of weeks before that had an accident with an iceberg out in the Atlantic, so they knew it was bad for ice that year, right?
Yes, and I'd like to know how anyone knows what was in Captain Smith's mind.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to embarrass anyone, but no one knows. To say that Captain Smith didn't seem to think, or didn't think, or whatever, I don't know what Captain Smith thought. I can tell you what he did. As he approached the ice, the ship came in sight of the ice about 11:30. And now you have to understand when I give these times, they're relative, and that time is a big factor in this, and I can't get into because I need to show you. But
right.
Nonetheless, he started to turn. This is what I said. My navigation, based on what the fourth officer, who was the navigating officer that night, what he gave the carts, they turned left about 44 minutes before the accident, and that's critical to understanding what went wrong. The left turn of 1 point indicates to me that Smith was not ignoring the ice, was well aware of the ice. His intention was to keep it just in sight from the bridge. It's a good idea to keep your enemy in sight.
Yeah.
And let's say about, I think, and I'll tell you, the bridge you could see almost a little over 9 miles to the horizon from Titanic's bridge. So I think he meant to stay at least 8 miles away from the ice that night. That should have been safe enough under any conditions that would normally expect on the North Atlantic. Coulda, woulda, and shoulda apparently were employed that night, but I believe the man was operating in a safe and prudent manner for 1912.
Right.
Now, that said, it's the master of, I believe it's Mauritania, chose to go, I think it's 65 or something miles south of the ice, and added probably, I'm going to say maybe, a couple of hours to the crossing time, meaningless amount of time, and never saw any ice in that same time period, same time of reference. So Captain Smith could have avoided the ice totally, and he didn't. But I think what he was doing was logical. It didn't work, but it was a logical thing before Titanic sank. Looking back in hindsight, I don't think even Captain Smith would think of doing it again.
Right. Do you think that this decision was based on his amount of coal that might have been left?
No.
No?
Not directly. I think he was low on coal in the sense that he didn't have enough reserve to spend a lot of time on the ocean, okay?
Right.
But I don't believe that. I think if there was a problem that night, it was J. Bruce Ismay, who was asleep down in his cabin. Ismay was the chairman of the board of White Star Line, and I think, frankly, had a way of getting his way, and he did not want to waste any time on this crossing, and I think Smith was forced into maybe not being as prudent as he might have been, but I can't prove that.
Right.
I cannot prove that.
He didn't write anything down that anybody could see and say, boy, this Bruce Ismay is driving me nuts. There is nothing left that we can look at that can say that, he was being bullied by anybody to do anything, So we kind of, what was going on in his mind, you're right. It's a little hard to figure out. We have to go to break again. And the two songs that I picked for the break is El Capitan and Elite Syncopations. And these were two very popular songs back at that time that all the ships were playing. And our guest is driving, and we're hoping he stays real safe as he's driving, because David Brown, we don't want anything happening to you, and so be safe. We'll be right back. This is Mo Banshee's Lair on GameCon Radio.
You are listening to GameCon Radio.
You've got questions.
Who are we?
Where do we come from?
Are we alone in the universe?
Is there life after death?
Where can I take a class and really learn about demonology? Now, get the answers. For a decade, the American Institute of Metaphysics has offered the ultimate in courses designed to serve as the foundation in your search for life's questions. The courses cover a variety of subject areas and consist of wide-ranging alternative sciences, theories, and philosophies. Each course comes complete with textbooks, work materials, and instructions. The courses allow you the freedom to pursue your own areas of interest according to your schedule. Whether it's UFOs, life after death, demonology, cryptozoology, and more, you've got questions. We've got answers. Visit www.instituteofmetaphysics.com or call 877-623-3241 and start your search now.
Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio and GameCon Radio, and our very special guest tonight, Captain David G. Brown, who has written a book, The Last Log of Titanic, and there's another book out, Titanic Myths, Titanic Truths, How a Series of Errors Caused the history's most famous maritime disaster. Dave is driving home from a lecture and doing our interview at the same time. So is everything okay, Dave?
Yeah, except they're going to extract some money from my wallet here at this toll booth.
Okay. Okay, I'll let you do that. And we want you to make sure you're safe. So we've been talking about, what possibly happened during this whole thing to make this disaster what it is. And while Dave is busy taking care of his toll, this is not the first time there's been a huge loss of life due to a shipping accident. Back in 1905, the General Slocum was like a ferry in the New York harbor, and it had was taking a bunch of people from the German immigrant community to a picnic at Locust Point, and it's on Long Island's North Shore. And a fire broke out on the ferry, and it was mostly women and children that were going on this picnic. And there were 1,358 people on board the Slocum. And of that 1,358 people, 1,021 died. They were mostly women and children. And the reason was because the women and children could not swim. And when they grabbed the life jackets, it was found that the life jackets were rotted and the fire hoses were bursting under pressure. So women and children that did jump into the water to get away from the flames drowned. And as I said, 1,021 women and children died that day, June 15th, 1904, in New York Harbor off of Long Island. So one would think that this is an absolute horror story, but I guess because it's within the bay, New York Harbor, people, I guess, don't feel the same way. They don't have that horrible sense of loss that to this day people think of the Titanic and, oh my God, the loss of life, the loss of life. And I don't know if it's because the people on Titanic, a lot of them were very rich and wealthy. You know, we're trying to get our heads around how do you let the Strausses drown on a ship that's on its maiden voyage when they've paid something like what would be akin to maybe $500,000 for both of them to be on this ship. And you know, I guess people just can't understand how that could happen. But for me, I can't understand how anybody could let the tragedy of the Slocum happen. To me, that is an absolutely horrid thing because they died of either drowning or fire. So the Titanic is a horrible maritime disaster, but in my opinion, it's not quite as bad as the Slocum because it was mostly women and children that died there. So I don't know. I'm just throwing that out because Dave is paying a toll and all. Any thoughts on that?
I'm back. You are absolutely right. And I'll tell you, there's an ironic sinking in Chicago. Partially can be blamed on Titanic. There was a steamer called the Eastland, and it was really a very cranky ship from the beginning. It was known to be top heavy and all. And honestly, today it wouldn't have got a certificate to sail, but that was another era. And they forced them to put lifeboats on it for everyone after the Titanic. And the weight of the lifeboats is one of the factors. It's not the only factor, but it is a factor in why it was still tied up to the docks in the Chicago River. It wasn't even underway. It was tied up, and everybody ran to one side. The east one rolled over, and more than 830 women and children died in that accident. So, you know, as I will tell you, and every pilot will say the same thing, that all progress in safety is written in blood. And we learn from these things. Now, part of the thing that we've learned, when I've been through the Coast Guard inspection of a passenger vessel, the idea of life jackets being, you know, allowed to rot, it won't happen. I have watched a Coast Guard inspector stick a knife and rip open a jacket just so that it couldn't be used. And all you can do is say thank you. I mean, and that's what he should do. The stability of ships, the Eastland would never get a certificate because the Coast Guard is very, very concerned about stability. You learn these things as time goes on. They could have been brighter and better in the era, but, you know, the reality is they were what they were, and we have to accept that, but we don't have to make their mistake. That's, you know, the good thing about people is we can learn from other people's mistakes.
Right.
Or we should.
So let's, we're in the final half hour pretty much of this show. And we've got we almost ran over the other commercial, so we've got 10, 15 minutes to the next commercial. There was a coal fire on the ship, right? But you don't feel that had any weigh in on the ship, on the speed it was going or anything else, right?
Well, there was a bunker fire, and more than likely caused by spontaneous combustion, probably of low-grade coal obtained at Harland and Wolff for the what was called the transit trip, which became its only sea trials. And it was probably railroad coal, would be my guess. I don't know. Never seen a record on it. But the coal they put in ships was much different, less likely to spontaneously combust than railroad coal. But with that strike, you know, I suppose they used what they could get. The bunker fire burned until actually the Saturday before the ship struck the iceberg, and the fire was so hot that it actually caused a distortion of the metal of the bulkhead, and against which it burned. So it was pretty good. It created a lot of heat. Apparently, it didn't do any real structural damage, and there's no evidence that damage caused a failure of the bulkhead. There's a lot of speculation that it might have. I mean, in the public press, but I've not seen anything that would stand, real scrutiny on that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the bulkhead, the fire, I should say, I don't think it had anything to do with the sinking. But what it did is by placing that bunker, the fire in the right bunker, we discovered that fire places the end of damage one compartment further forward. Everybody says that it was in Boiler Room 5 because Barrett said he was there, but if you read his testimony, the lawyers questioning him led him. They would tell him it was in Boiler Room number 5, and he would agree. So, was it or wasn't it? Well, I don't think it was, because if it had been in Boiler Room 5, it would have caused heat transfer through that buckled metal into another bunker in Boiler Room 6, and they would have had a fire in two bunkers, and we know from two separate witnesses that there was only a fire in one bunker.
Okay, well, I had read that the fire had been put out the day before the sinking.
Yes, on Saturday.
So that would not have attributed, because a lot of people say, well, there was a fire I've read there was a fire in the bunker, so that they tried to speed up to beat out the fire. So that is a complete make up. Then that's a myth. That's not true.
No, you wouldn't. I don't know how speeding up would put out the fire.
Mm-hmm. Well, they were trying to beat it. Yeah, I don't know. I guess the theory is if there were a fire that was, they were keeping it at bay, but they were trying to get to where they could get the passengers off and then take care of it. The other one was the glasses, the binoculars. There were stories circulated that the lookouts didn't have binoculars, but you and I were talking about that this afternoon.
Well, they didn't have binoculars, and that's not a bad thing. Again, I can go to Walmart today and buy a set of binoculars that are better than anything available in 1912 because of the knowledge of coatings and things. Our binoculars today work at night much better than anything available, and especially anything British. Now, the Germans had some coatings they were working on, and it was a military secret kind of thing at that point. But the British didn't. So their glasses were not good for night, and basically you don't use binoculars to search for, dangers ahead. You use your full vision, and especially at night. Binoculars force you to use your central vision, which is not very sensitive to light. That's our color vision. The very sensitive to light, black and white section of our retina is on the outside of the color section. So if you use binoculars, you actually reduce your ability to see things. And lookouts learn to look above or below the horizon and catch the sight of something that they can't see looking straight at it. And so you wouldn't really want binoculars up in the crow's nest in 1912. A lot of captains wouldn't allow them up there. There was some testimony as to that. And it's a non-starter again as an argument. It's one of those that sounds good, but it doesn't fit the way the human eye works and how you find danger. It's kind of like people said, they should have had a spotlight. Well, yeah, but if you have a spotlight, then you night blind yourself to any danger that's not in the spotlight. Mm-hmm. Well, if you've blinded yourself to everything else, God, help you. You're going to be run down by another ship or whatever. I mean, you can't do that. You've got to depend, especially when you don't have radar, you've got to depend on your Mod 1, Mark 1 eyeball.
Mm-hmm. We were talking about that today, about the spotlight too, and thank you for bringing that up. Would more lifeboats have saved all the people, do you think?
History does not reveal its alternatives. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Okay. They had time to launch 16 boats correctly. They got one of the collapsibles actually launched correctly. Another one they managed to get in the water, and two had trouble with, floated off, one wound up upside down. The answer is they didn't have enough time to launch more boats. So would they have saved more lives? Only if you had more people trained, and that means you have to go into modern thinking. Mm-hmm. Could they have used the lifeboats better? Obviously. But then you get into the concern of, do you want to set panic off? And there was, I believe, some panic at the very end. I don't want to say that I know for a fact, but I think there was even some gunfire. I suspect it, I want to say, at the very end. So, I think that it's a non-issue. They had what they had, and what they had was designed around a theory that wasn't a bad theory. It just was one that has fallen out of popular thinking, mostly because it sounds so good. Everybody's got a seat in the lifeboat. Now if you think about it, Titanic's the only a passenger ship that I can think of that remained level. That is, the decks didn't lean one way or the other. Dirty little secret is if the ship leans more than a certain amount of degrees, and that depends on the height of the lifeboats off the waterline, and it depends on the type of davits. But as the ship leans over, the high side boats can't be launched. So you take like the last time a major ocean liner truly sank, the Andrea Doria, the lifeboats, half the lifeboats were useless. And so the people on Doria wound up in the same boat, literally, as the people on Titanic, half enough lifeboats.
Well, didn't that just happen on that one in Greece?
Well, that's a different story.
But it rolled on its side. They couldn't get all the things off of it, or did they get all the lifeboats off before it rolled?
I'm not sure what they got off. I mean, I have not really studied that, so I don't want to put.
Okay.
You know, sometimes every time I open my mouth is to change feet, and I don't want to do it right now.
I understand.
The fact is that that's a totally different circumstance because that ship never sank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I got one more question before we go to break. And this is a question you put down, so you got to answer it, okay? What do you think of James Cameron's theory about the way the ship broke up and sank?
I don't think Titanic was a banana boat.
You watched the banana bit, right?
Yeah, I am totally unimpressed with it. Now, I want to say one thing. Anyone interested in Titanic has to bow down to the tremendous amount of money and time that James Cameron has put into finding out as much as possible about the wreck. Nobody has done more to further research.
Right.
But I think he's totally wrong about the breakup.
Well, I'm going to get into the banana bit. You know, when he's bending it, I mean, I've got lupus and stuff, so I'm not strong, but I go to bend this banana, and you got a better chance of the banana squirting out the sides than that top piece breaking. And if you watch him, he used his fingernail to cut through it so that it would break up on top. So why he used the banana, I'm not quite sure.
I am. Watch his movie. In his movie, the deck breaks and the boat breaks from the top down.
Okay, what's your theory?
Well, now wait a minute. He did that because it's good movie making.
Okay.
I agree with good movie making. I don't think he has to defend it. He feels that he has to defend it.
Right.
I don't think he does because it's a movie. It's not reality.
Yeah, and there was no Jack Dawson and Rose, because that would have never happened right there. That would have never happened on that ship to begin with.
But my point is, it's a movie, and I don't care that it isn't exactly right. He caught the terror of the moment.
Yes.
And that's what he should have done. He did his job. So what if it's a little bit sketchy on history? You get the feeling as if you were there. I like the scene. Mm-hmm. But I think, and I've worked with engineers on reconstructions and so forth, and what I find is that there's among the engineering community, there's a kind of a down your nose kind of looking at people who do history. And so they tend to ignore what the historian finds in the record. And they tend to create out of what they think is true a scenario. And God love them, because if it weren't for engineers, I wouldn't have ships to drive. Mm-hmm. They're good at designing them. I don't think they're as good at figuring out what happens if they, afterward. But I've done a book on the Great Lakes, a major storm in 1913, and what I was rather surprised to find is that there were several ships, not one, but several, that broke in half under circumstances very much like Titanic. Not that they were sitting on a calm ocean. They were in 35-foot waves and 90-knot winds with a white, a whiteout snow. I mean, but the hull was facing the same thing. It was being bent beyond its structural strength limits. Mm-hmm. And one of them, the Hydrus, was in sight of another vessel, and it simply cracked in half like an eggshell and sank. And what I found is these ships all suffered from what are called girdling cracks that go around the ship, but they're around in the horizontal, and the result is it breaks into two pieces. And this is exactly what Titanic did, if you will. And what I think is I'd like to see the engineers, instead of looking at the side of the ship, look at it from the end on, and I think you'd see that what was happening is, like you said about the banana, the sides squirt out, and I think the sides failed. The port side failed first, I'm sure of that, and that precipitated the breakup. But it was a rather longer event than anybody has suggested. The breakup started, and that's when they were still launching lifeboats, and it caused the ship to lose its starboard list and roll over to port. This is my take on it. I admit that I'm out now in engineering la land, and any engineers out there can take pot shots as they want, but I think that this fits. My theory fits the historical reality of hulls built of steel of that quality with riveted construction in that era. And then the rest of the breakup followed. And at some point, chaos takes over, and who knows what happened. I don't have a back-facing crystal ball, so I can't tell you. At some point, it was, all hell was breaking loose, and that's literally.
Yeah. So, we're going to go to a break, the last break, and then I'm going to give you something to think about when you come back, and I'll tell you during the break what it is, and you can answer it. The last two songs we picked are The Merry Widow and Nearer My God to Thee, but not the American Nearer Thy God to Thee that most people think of. I know that the people that were from England were probably singing, it's called Horbury, and that's the tune. And what people might not be aware of is that there are names of tunes as well as name of songs. And when you go through your hymnal, that there are certain songs that you can swap the tunes and sing the words for the other tune too, because the words will fit either tune. And so the tune that I personally believe would probably be the more prominent hymn that they were trying to sing is Nearer My God to Thee, but Horbury, Horbury, and it's sung by the choir of Wells Cathedral, but the first one is The Merry Widow. And remember, the band is trying to keep people calm. They're trying to keep the children occupied by playing music so that they don't really have time to process things. They're trying to help keep things quiet and calm as things are getting worse and worse, and there's no help in sight. Before we go to break, I was telling Dave today that Gordon Lightfoot wrote the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. There's one line in that song that always comes to me whenever I hear of a sinking or a disaster at sea, and it's, does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? You're sitting in freezing cold water. You're watching a ship go down. There's no one in sight. These minutes that these people were freezing to death had to seem like hours to them. I can't even imagine what it was like to be on the deck and know that you're not going to make it, that this ship is going to break up. It's already starting to fail, and you're going to die. And I can't even imagine what these people went through. And you're absolutely right, Dave. Cameron did capture every single minute of that. We'll be right back. This is GameCon Radio.
Hey, little girl, what would you do for a Klondike bar? GameCon Radio, the station your mother warned you about.
Yes?
Hi, I'm here for the New York Ghost Tour.
Sorry, we're closed. But you can come back next week.
Next week? Forget that. I'll just go check out another place.
Trust me, there's no place half as interesting as ours, dear.
That's so not true. What about the Shanley Hotel in Napanock?
Once you've been to one haunted hotel, you've been to them all.
Not like this place. The Shanley Hotel dates back to 1845, and since then it's been a hotspot for paranormal activity. Mysterious music, smells, whistling, doors opening, footsteps. Almost everything you can imagine has been experienced at that hotel.
It's open to the public?
Absolutely. Sal and Cindy, the owners of the hotel, welcome people for regular stays or investigations, and their rates are beyond reasonable. They even offer workshops and in-house psychics.
How did you learn about this place?
By visiting www.shanleyhotel.com. You can get history, investigation info, and much more.
Thanks, I think I will. Just don't tell any of our customers.
Your secret's safe with me. It's not like anyone can hear us.
Welcome back to Mo Banshee's Lair, Visionary Talk Radio, and that was The Merry Widow and Near My God to the Hornbury tune. And our special guest tonight, Dave G. Brown. He's a captain. He is a maritime expert, and he's written books about Titanic, The Last Log of Titanic, and Titanic Myths, Truths, How a Series of Errors Caused Titanic's Most Famous Maritime Disaster. Let me ask you, Dave, what have you found out anything that was like a huge revelation for you, or a shock that turned you around with this investigation?
You know, I want to surprise you because, in a way, no, not about Titanic. What I have found, however, is the power of myth. If my latest book had been another story of how the ship is turning left and just grazed the starboard bow, if it was a standard stock book, I could stand a chance of maybe even getting it widely distributed by bookstores. Because that's the story everybody wants. Cameron tapped into that root of myth. He was dead nuts accurate when it comes to tapping into the public idea of what they want Titanic to be, a Greek tragedy. Once you strip that away, the problem is you start to attack the people who are experts in the myth. Not deliberately, but, there are people out there who are absolute experts in the myth. They've got books published, papers published. I mean to tell you, and you walk up and it's basically the old emperor's got no clothes on, Mm-hmm. Hey, and they, you're pulling on the guy saying, hey, look, you're naked. They don't like that. And I have had people literally attack me with libel in the sense that they have tried to prevent me from being able to earn a living as a writer about Titanic by impugning my knowledge, my research, and impugning my writing, only because I had touched something and shown that what a core fact was wrong in their whole theory, and this is particularly about the time, which I say doesn't fit radio. But and it really surprised me that how much this process of they all wanted peer review. Well, the reason I wanted peer review is the whole idea is to keep anybody from changing the story because they don't want to have to admit they were wrong. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that surprised me, is that myth is tenfold as powerful as the truth. Mm-hmm. And you can get, I knew that, people like a good story better than the truth, but I didn't realize that the myths would be so important. Mm-hmm. And you see even Cameron trying to defend the way he had the ship break up. And he's fostering a myth. He doesn't need to. The guy's movie is great. Just let it be. But it doesn't have to be true. It's a movie. Mm-hmm. But so now we're going to have people who watch that show and who say, oh, all of the experts say, when in fact the experts in some cases, if you listen to them, we're disagreeing. I think it's the power of myth. It is really, it drives human emotion and it drives human thinking far more than we want to admit.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, what do you think about salvaging the wreck site?
Well, there's only one thing I think should have been salvaged. Absolutely, positively should have been brought up. And a judge said, no, you got to leave it there, and that is the telegraph key. For almost everything in Titanic was off-the-shelf 1912 Harland and Wolff shipbuilding. There was not, I'm sorry to those who think it was the ship magnificent or the ship, the ship of dreams. It was pretty stock, late Edwardian stuff. And, but the telegraph key, which could have been picked up easily a few years ago. That telegraph key is what rescued the 700 and some survivors. Right. That telegraph key is what changed Titanic from being another sea story to what it is. It's where the myths were created as well as the history. And I think that's the one piece that should have been brought up and that we should have. That is the unique part of Titanic. And of course, they can't take anything off the wreck. I think it was, frankly, the only thing the judge could do, but under the circumstance that it has stolen from us that piece of history that belongs to all of us. It's not being preserved down there. It's being lost down there.
Yeah. I'm torn. Years and years ago, I thought, no, it's a grave site. But then, as we do, we get older, and I'm thinking, well, what is the difference between that and digging up the body of a pharaoh in a tomb in Egypt, or digging up a grave site for someone that died, in England? And I thought, there are no bodies there. They were eaten by marine organisms 90 years ago. 98 years ago, I'm sure most of the remains were gone. It doesn't take long for sea critters to get in there and do their worst, So there aren't human remains there. And one thing I could say about Titanic is she has made more money since she sunk than I think she ever would have made when she was floating. What do you think?
No question about it. It's the truth.
She is making money hand over fist.
I think that if there are bodies in the shipwreck that are recognizable or have not, deteriorated to the point that, there's nothing there. And the other thing is, in any case, if there are survivors of immediate family, I don't mean second cousin 3 times removed.
Right.
But I think you can argue gravesite, you can argue things like that. But in reality, what is the difference between saying, don't touch Titanic because people died there? Why then don't we leave all of the car wrecks in which people die on the highway?
Yeah.
So, I think that we have to do things with deference to the families. Yes, I know one shipwreck that we do know that there are bodies, and I am not going to say anything about it.
Right.
What I know, I will keep probably to my grave, because I'm old enough that they won't necessarily go away in my lifetime.
Right.
Simply because there are living relatives, living wives, and living children who that's not just an artifact on the bottom. That's Dad. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference. And but when you get to Titanic, that 100 years ago, I think that there are some rationale in salvaging some things. As I said, my rationale is you go for the historically valid pieces, and really the historically valid pieces, in my estimate. Now, somebody else may, say, oh, no, we should get the captain's bathtub. Well, I don't see it. It's a bathtub. I mean, it's not particularly maybe Captain Smith did take a bath in it, but it's just a bathtub,
Yeah.
I think that the telegraph key would be something that we should have. Certainly, if there was some evidence in the wreck that would clear up the story and tell their story, yes. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, you mentioned the Egyptians, and they had an idea that you were alive as long as people kept you in their memories. And that was one of the reasons why they had, in everybody's grave had Serdef figures, which were, the face or the head of the person, and why the families would take offerings to the grave and so forth. The idea of keeping the dead alive. And in my estimation, one of the ways to keep the people of Titanic from having, just disappearing is to keep Titanic alive. And we are, in a way, giving them life by talking about it, by looking at it, and trying to figure out what happened. And we are giving them life when we design safer ships, particularly when we design safer ships based on what we learned from that accident. So, it's a complicated discussion, and there is no yes or no. It's not a light switch, and everybody's going to have an opinion, and that's a valid way to end the conversation.
Yeah, I think so. We are out of time. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and, driving and doing an interview at the same time on a cell phone. When Dave started out, he says, "Oh my God, it's snowing." And I'm like, do we really want to do this interview while it's snowing and you're driving, And of course, Matthew is chimed in and said, "Don't hit any icebergs, iceberg dead ahead." But I'm glad that you're safe, and I very much appreciate you coming on. And like I said, we're going to call you back as soon as I get done with some things that I have to do. So the books are... I've been posting them, but let me say, the books are on Amazon.com, and I suppose you can order them through Borders and stuff like that. Titanic Myths, Titanic Truths, How a Series of Errors Caused History's Most Famous Maritime Disaster, and the other book is The Last Log of Titanic, What Really Happened on the Doomed Ship's Bridge. And we want you to read these books. These are informative. Dave knows what he's talking about. He teaches maritime safety and all of that stuff over, in Ohio. And I try to bring guests that actually know what they're talking about. So I hope that everybody will check out his books. And next week we're going to have a show. We're a little, Joe Resnick is supposed to come back and talk about Bigfoot, but we're a little shaky. He may not be able to make it. We're not sure yet, but we will have a show. And then on the 24th, my good friend Sherilyn is going to come back, and she's going to give us the predictions for 2013. And we have some really cool shows coming up. So I hope everybody will check out the schedule on GameCon. Check out asylumsgate.com. That's my own site. And we'll be here next week. And God bless everybody. Dave, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to say good night. I hope everybody is safe, and God bless everybody.
Somewhere over the rainbow, birds fly. Birds fly over the rainbow, while
Thank you for visiting me at my lair. Mo Banshee's Lair is broadcast live on Tuesday evenings at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Mountain, 7 p.m. Pacific, and in the UK, 3 a.m. Wednesday mornings on www.gameconradio.com. You can listen to our recent recordings on Podomatic/MoBanshee. You can contact me at www.asylumsgate.com. Again, thank you for listening. God bless you and yours, and have a very cool day.